When you visit Arizona, time is measured in moments, not minutes. Like the moment your work stress disappears as you kayak through the canyons. Or the moment you discover the life-changing effects of prickly pear chocolate. But nothing beats the moment you see the Grand Canyon for the very first time. Visit a new state of mind. Learn more at hereyouareaz.com.
It's October 25th, 1929, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Now, it's certainly hard to imagine greed and corruption forming any part of American politics these days. But it was on this day that a former US cabinet official was fined $100,000 and sent to jail for a year for a felony committed while in office. The senator was Albert Fall, former Secretary of the Interior, and the whole grubby affair was known rather charmingly as the Teapot Dome scandal.
The Teapot Dome, although it sounds charming, it's actually quite pedestrian. It was an oil field in Wyoming, and it was one of 3 oil fields which had been designated for use by the US Navy as a fuel reserve, in case of emergency.
Yes, and the president, Warren G. Harding, had just transferred the supervision of this oil reserve across from the Navy to the Department of the Interior. All sounds very bureaucratic, but it actually opened the door for Albert Fall to engage in this bit of corruption that ultimately led to his undoing.
It enabled him to offer private companies the chance to drill for oil on state land without competitive bidding. So he went to his mates and said, you need oil, I know some oil you can have, but also I do like cash. That's basically what happened. Yeah. President Harding had run on oil money. Like, he'd got to the White House by taking the donations of oil companies. He knew who'd paid for his campaign. He knew that the guy that he'd appointed to be his interior minister, yes, was a senator and a lawyer, but also a rancher and a miner. It was pretty clear that he was going to start selling this land as soon as he was appointed.
And it's easy to see how Senator Fall may have felt empowered to start doing some quite corrupt stuff behind the scenes, because Warren G. Harding's administration was renowned for its corruption. Not so much at the time. He actually died in office 2 years into his term. He died of a heart attack. And he was pretty popular. He'd won a landslide election because he'd promised, I don't know if you've ever heard the quote, return to normalcy.
It was Warren G's second album.
That was his campaign slogan, because in 1921, when he was elected, you just had World War I and you just had the Spanish flu pandemic, and his thing was everything back to normal. Everyone was so relieved that things were getting back to normal that nobody really paid a lot of attention, and most of this stuff never came out till after his death. But behind the scenes, it was very clubby, it was very glad-handy. He had this group of friends called the Ohio Gang, who were mostly people that he'd befriended when he was an Ohio state politician, and he kind of just brought them to Washington with him. And they had this residence called the Little Greenhouse on K Street, where all of his friends would just get together. They were, politicians and businessmen, and they just make these corrupt
deals. Play poker, have a whiskey, and sell hundreds of millions of dollars of oil from the state purse.
Yeah, but he had been really eulogized, apparently, as, inverted commas, an ideal American. And even up to his death, he was still regarded this way. And it was only later, as this scandal started to come out, that people began to revise their view of him. And he's now regarded as one of the worst presidents of US history.
And so we were talking about how what Albert Fall did was he sold off the rights to drill on this land to private companies without competitive bidding, but that actually wasn't illegal. So the whole reason that this came to be investigated was that an irate business rival of one of the oilmen who'd got this lease complained to his senator about this secretive deal. And so the senator, a man called John Kendrick, started pushing for an inquiry into it. And so it transpired that what he'd done wasn't illegal. There actually was no law saying that these contracts had to be put out to tender. The actual crime was just massive amounts of barely disguised bribery. It was money, but it was also things. You mentioned that Fall was a rancher. The bribes he'd received from oilmen included 6 heifers, 4 pigs, 2 boars and a bull, which sounds like a nursery rhyme about corruption.
It always seems so pathetic, the stuff that gets handed over in bribes as well, like a few bulls and a few pigs. I know that it all added up to hundreds of thousands of dollars, which then would have been millions in today's money. But, it still seems so mucky that you'd think that it would have been, like, I don't know, barrels of oil or gold ingots or something like that.
But it was bags of cash as well. We should talk about
there
the
was
cash.
that. Yeah.
So one of the cash bungs from an oil man called Edward Doheny was a $100,000 interest-free loan, in inverted commas, that was delivered in person by his son, Ned Doheny, to the senator in 5 $20,000 stacks in a black parcel bag, which they just tried to disguise by it being his son, and also he brought a mate along. He brought along this guy called Hugh Plunkett, remember that name for later. But they just handed over a big bag of cash.
That's how I get all of my completely over-the-board loans.
Yeah. And the bribes that he was given for the Teapot Dome lease were equally overtly suspicious. $200,000 worth of Liberty bonds were given to his family and Fall directly. So, there were, as well as the heifers, you're right, there was just this straight up cash being dumped on his front door.
Heifers and cash. Yeah. That was his third album.
And also the build-up to Fall going to prison, which is the date that we're commemorating, was long. So the Wall Street Journal first broke the story that Fall was giving oil deals to his mates on April the 14th, 1922. The next day, the Senate investigation was open. So this was 7 years later. By this point, as Rebecca said, the president was dead. There had a different administration in there. And it took them 7 years to actually get him behind bars. He ended up serving 9 months in jail before being released due to failing health and died in 1944.
And there must have been some kind of discrepancy in the legal representation they secured, because Albert Fall was found guilty of accepting bribes from Edward Doheny. Doheny was found not guilty of offering Fall bribes.
Because it was a loan. It was a loan. We said it was a loan. That was the defence. But it did turn tragic. I told you to remember the name Hugh Plunkett. Hugh Plunkett, Edward Doheny's son's friend, then shot Edward Doheny's son and himself dead, because he was worried about the repercussions because they delivered the cash. So long term, Doheny didn't play this as well as he might have liked.
And there's some theories that it also contributed to President Harding's death, that it took this real severe toll on his health, and gradually over the couple of years that he was in office, he became increasingly disillusioned and exhausted. But he died before the full extent of all of this wrongdoing was determined.
Can I just add one more thing on the absolute audacity of Edward Doheny? When Fall was in prison, Doheny's company foreclosed on his ranch over unpaid loans. Guess which unpaid loan it turned out to be.
Well.
He had chutzpah, didn't he? And actually, the oil baron Playview, played by Daniel Day-Lewis in There Will Be Blood, is a composite of all these various corrupt oilmen from the early 20th century. But I did find it entertaining that the mansion that Playview lives in was played by Doheny's actual mansion.
Oh, nice.
So if you watch There Will Be Blood, they're walking through the corridors where his son was killed. It's just a little detail that adds some authenticity to the movie that is not made explicit, which I thought was pretty cool.
Great movie, by the way.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I worked pretty hard on it.
One of your best. Yeah. Well done, Edward Doheny's house.
I mean, it is still the case, isn't it, that big money controls who has the finances to get to the White House. I was going to say they've never amended that, but I don't think there's any interest in amending that, is there? Like, that's how America works.
No, I mean, if anything, it's been baked increasingly into the system, where your donors get you into office and then you give them kickbacks as you go on. And not only that, but you're expected as a congressperson to be making just hundreds and hundreds of calls throughout the time that you are in elected office to keep the money flowing.
And in terms of the legacy, it might not be obvious how relevant the Teapot Dome scandal is to us now, but the thing that I find really interesting about it is that until Watergate in the 1970s, this was the go-to phrase to express government corruption, political scandal in US history. At the time that this all came out, one of Fall's peers in the Senate, the North Dakota Senator Gerald Nye, called it the slimiest of slimy trails beaten by privilege. And that was the role it held in kind of US culture. It was this ultimate, you only had to say Teapot Dome and people knew the kind of thing you were talking about. It's just
a really rubbish suffix, though, so you couldn't say the water Teapot Dome.
Yeah, I mean, we did Saxgate, didn't we, last week?
Yeah.
Couldn't have Sax Dome, doesn't feel right.
Nah, sucks.
And so another week of retrospecting ends. But next week begins a day early at Club Retrospectors. Join us now to get an exclusive episode every Sunday. Patreon.com/retrospectors.